Over the past few years, I've explored countless abandoned places, empty buildings, deserted roads, and some of the creepiest forests you could imagine. People always say that places like those are haunted by ghosts, but I never believed that. I always thought the real danger came from people, not the supernatural. Right up until that night, I refused to think otherwise. There's no need to tell you my name, but you should know that I was living in San Antonio, Texas. I was 18 years old at the time. The COVID pandemic had just begun. Schools were shut down. The entire city had suddenly fallen silent. Most people stayed locked inside their homes, but my friends and I, we did the exact opposite. Almost every night, we went looking for another abandoned place to explore. I had no idea that one decision would become the most terrifying memory of my life.
At the time, I had just started dating a girl named Clarissa. We both went to the same high school. We hadn't known each other for very long, but she'd already started trusting me enough to go along with my crazy adventure ideas. One night, I said to her, "If you want to have a night you'll never forget, come with me." She refused at first, then she laughed and finally agreed. Our destination was O.P. Schnabel Park in San Antonio, Texas. During the day, the park is peaceful, beautiful, and full of people, but after dark, the gates are locked by the police. And it isn't just because of the darkness. Long before we ever went there, the woods had already earned a reputation for bloodshed and unsolved. I already knew quite a bit about that park. A few years earlier, a 24-year-old woman had been brutally murdered there. Later, a teenage boy was also found shot to death deep inside the woods. After those tragedies, most people stayed far away from the area once night fell. But for me, the darker a place's history was, the more I wanted to explore it. At around 3 a.m. that night, we parked my truck out of sight just outside the park, then quietly slipped through the entrance. The darkness was overwhelming. The towering trees swallowed even the faint moonlight above us. Clarissa kept gripping my hand tighter and tighter, while I still believed this was going to be just another ordinary urban exploration. Whenever I explored abandoned places, I followed one simple rule. Only use a flashlight when you absolutely have to. A bright light ruins your night vision, and more importantly, anyone hiding in the distance can spot your location almost instantly. So that night, we relied almost entirely on the darkness to guide us. The forest was unnaturally silent. No crickets, no wind rustling through the leaves. Nothing. The only sound was the soft crunch of our footsteps along the trail. For nearly 20 minutes, we stayed on the main path. Then I remembered a narrow side trail. It cut straight toward the parking area and would save us some time. I looked at Clarissa and said, "Let's take this trail. It'll get us back a lot faster." Without a second thought, she nodded and followed me. We turned onto the narrow side trail. Dense bushes and towering trees crowded both sides of the path, so closely that it felt as though the forest was slowly swallowing us. We had been walking for barely 2 minutes when suddenly a soft, haunting melody cut through the silence. It was the sound of a flute. I froze. Clarissa stopped beside me. The tune was crystal clear, as if someone with years of experience was calmly playing an old melody. And that was exactly what made it so terrifying. At 3 o'clock in the morning, in the middle of a deserted forest, who could possibly be playing a flute? Neither of us said a word. We simply stood there and listened. And with every passing second, the melody sounded clearer, closer, as though whoever was playing it was slowly making their way toward us. At first, I convinced myself that it was probably just someone sitting in the woods playing music late at night. But less than 20 seconds later, I felt Clarissa's hand begin to tremble. I looked at her. Her face had turned completely pale. She looked like she was on the verge of tears. In a shaky voice, she quietly began to pray. "Please get us out of here safely. If I've done anything wrong, please forgive me." Seeing her like that, for the first time that night, I felt a wave of uneasiness myself. But the strangest part was the sound. The flute wasn't coming from one direction. It seemed to echo through the entire forest, as if it surrounded us from every side. And with every passing moment, it felt closer, closer, like whatever was playing it was slowly closing in on us. I did everything I could to stay calm. If I lost control too, Clarissa would completely fall apart. I squeezed her hand tightly and whispered, "Don't be afraid. I'm not going to let anything happen to you." As I said those words, I wasn't even sure if I believed them myself, or if I was simply trying to give her the courage to keep moving. One thing was clear. If we stayed where we were, whoever was playing that flute would eventually find us. I made a split-second decision. The only option was to run. We took off down the narrow trail as fast as we could. For a few seconds, it seemed like the flute had suddenly fallen silent, but we never got the chance to feel relieved, because what happened next was far worse. We had barely run 30 or 40 feet, when suddenly, the bushes directly in front of us exploded with movement. The next instant, dry branches snapped one after another, as if something incredibly heavy was charging straight toward us at full speed. Before I could even react, something enormous leaped across the trail in a single bound. A powerful gust of air slammed into my face, but my eyes never caught a clear glimpse of it. No shape, no figure, no shadow. The strangest part was, I never heard it coming, and I never heard it leave. For a single heartbeat, it was there. Then, it was gone. The forest fell silent once again. Clarissa screamed, and without thinking, my legs chose a... Without wasting a single second, we turned around and sprinted back the way we had come. My heart was pounding so hard, I could hear it echoing in my ears. I couldn't shake the feeling that if we had stayed on that trail for even one more second, we might never have made it out alive. But as soon as we reached the spot where we'd first heard the flute, the melody started again. This time, it was louder than ever. It sounded as though someone was standing only a few feet away, playing the flute right beside us. Yet no matter how hard we listened, we still couldn't tell where it was coming from. It had no direction. It seemed to drift through every tree, every shadow, as if the entire forest itself had begun. For the first time that night, I realized we were truly trapped. One path led back to the dark side trail, where something enormous and completely unknown had just crossed right in front of us. The other led to the main trail, where that haunting flute melody refused to stop following us. Both choices felt equally terrifying. I quickly scanned our surroundings. The off-road trail disappeared into a wall of dense trees and thick brush, where you couldn't see anything beyond a few feet. At least the main trail was open, a wide concrete path. If there really was another person out there,
We might actually see them before they reached us. I looked over at Clarissa. Her eyes were filled with nothing but fear. I took one deep breath, then said, "We're taking the main trail."
We took off down the main trail as fast as we could. The adrenaline had completely taken over. The same trail that had taken us nearly 20 minutes to walk earlier now seemed to disappear beneath our feet in barely 7 or 8 minutes. I kept forcing myself to glance over my shoulder, but every time there was nothing, only an endless wall of darkness. After a while, I realized something. The flute had stopped, or at least I couldn't hear it anymore. Had it really gone silent? Or were our hearts pounding so loudly that we'd become deaf to everything else? Then, up ahead, a single portable restroom came into view beside the trail. The sight of it made my feet slow for just a moment. One terrifying thought flashed through my mind. What if someone was hiding behind it? Or worse, waiting for us inside? I never took my eyes off that portable restroom, not for a single second. We passed right beside it, but I didn't make the mistake of stopping. The door was closed. There wasn't a sound coming from inside, and there was no sign of anyone nearby. Even so, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was standing inside, listening to every breath we took. We kept running. A few minutes later, the trees began to thin out. Finally, the park's main entrance came into view. My truck was still sitting there, completely alone. The parking lot was empty, as if no one but us had ever been there that night. Without looking back, we jumped into the truck. I started the engine and drove away from that place as fast as I possibly could, leaving it. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The same question kept replaying in my mind. What exactly had we heard out there? I told several of my friends the entire story. Most of them laughed. They said it was probably just someone messing around in the woods with a flute. Others suggested that, in our panic, we had mistaken the sound of an animal for music. But I knew what we'd heard. It wasn't random noise. It wasn't an animal. It was a clear, beautiful, perfectly rhythmic melody. There was no mistaking it. Later that day, I started searching the internet. I hoped someone else had experienced something similar in those woods, but what I found didn't give me any answers. Instead, it raised even more questions than I had before. As I dug deeper, I found plenty of unsettling stories connected to that park. Some people claimed they had seen strange shadows moving through the woods at night. Others wrote about mysterious groups gathering deep inside the forest. A few believed there were hidden homeless camps scattered throughout the area. Others even shared rumors about secret religious rituals taking place after dark. But there was one thing I couldn't find anywhere. Not a single person mentioned hearing a flute, especially not in the middle of the forest at 3 o'clock in the morning. I searched through countless forums, read old discussion threads, even studied maps of the area. The nearest houses were far from the woods, far too far away for a melody that clear and that loud to carry through the trees. That's when another question entered my mind. If that music hadn't been coming from a person, then who or what had been playing it? The more I replayed that night in my mind, the stranger everything became. The first thing I realized was, the flute never came from a single direction. Every time we heard it, it seemed to move around us, as if the sound was circling us from every side. Then there was that mysterious thing, the one that crossed the trail right in front of us. If it had been a deer or any other wild animal, Why didn't we see its silhouette? Why did we hear it for only a single instant, and then nothing at all? But the biggest question of all was this: why did the flute begin playing again at the exact moment we turned around? It felt as though something was watching us. Something understood every move we made, and it was deliberately steering us from one path to another. Even now, just thinking about it sends a chill down my spine. After that night, I continued exploring abandoned buildings, deserted factories, and forgotten places. But one thing had changed forever. Before that experience, I ignored every strange sound. Afterward, I questioned every single step I took. Clarissa made one thing perfectly clear. She told me she'd never set foot in another forest with me after dark. To be honest, neither would I. I never found the courage to return to O.P. Shabble Park at night. Some memories, no matter how badly you want to forget them, only come back sharper with time. For a while, I believed that night would remain the most terrifying story of my life. But I was wrong. A few months later, I heard another story, one that brought everything from that night right back to life. A few months later, I met a young man who worked as a pharmacy technician at a mid-sized hospital in northwestern Alabama. While we were talking, the conversation eventually turned to scary experiences. He looked at me and said, "If you think the woods are the scariest place to be at night, you've obviously never been inside a hospital at 2 o'clock in the morning." The seriousness on his face told me immediately he wasn't joking. He explained that he worked the 6 p.m. to 4 a.m. shift, 7 nights on, followed by 7 days off. On paper, it didn't sound that bad, but according to him, working nights slowly wears down both your body and your mind. Then he began telling me about one particular night, a night he still hasn't been able to forget. He told me that week his wife was staying at her aunt's house, helping take care of her younger cousins. The house was in a quiet, isolated area, and it didn't even have curtains on the windows. On the last night of her stay, she insisted that he come over too. After getting off work, he arrived there at around 5 a.m., but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't fall asleep. The next day, they took the kids to school. After that, they attended a gender reveal party. Then they spent the afternoon shopping for groceries and household supplies. By the time evening came, he had to head straight back to the hospital for another shift. After an entire day of running from one place to another, he had managed no more than 10 minutes of sleep. By then, he had been awake for well over 24 hours, and the truly terrifying part of the night hadn't even begun. As soon as he arrived at the hospital, he grabbed a large energy drink, hoping it would keep him awake. He knew that if he sat down for even a minute, he'd probably fall asleep right there. At first, everything seemed completely normal. With his earbuds in, he was restocking medications for the operating rooms. It was late at night. The last few surgeries were wrapping up, while the housekeeping staff moved through the halls cleaning the rooms. At that hour, doctors, nurses, or technicians could walk into a room at any moment. So whenever he heard a door open behind him, he automatically turned around to see who had come in. That night, he heard one of the doors slowly creak open. The old hinges groaned, then it slammed shut with a heavy thud. Smiling to himself, he casually turned around, expecting to see someone standing there. But the room was empty. He was completely alone. At first, he didn't think much of it. He figured someone had started to walk into the room, then changed their mind and gone somewhere else. So he went back to work. A little while later, he pushed his medication cart into the next operating room. This one was completely dark. As soon as he opened the door, he thought he saw someone bent over beside the Omnicell machine, digging through the sharps disposal container. That immediately caught his attention. Not long before that, a hospital employee had been caught searching through used syringes and medication vials, trying to recover leftover morphine. So he assumed someone was attempting the same thing again. He quickly reached for the light switch, flipped it on, and stepped forward, ready to confront them. The lights flooded the room, but there was no one there. Just an empty operating room, the silent Omnicell machine, and a sharps container, still completely closed. For the first time that night, he tried to convince himself that it was nothing more than sleep deprivation. After all, he'd been awake for well over a full day. Taking a deep breath, he finished the rest of his work in the operating rooms. Then, at around 2 a.m., he loaded his cart with patient medications and headed to the hospital floors. Like every other night, his job was to deliver medications to the nurses' stations for each unit. When he reached the 5th floor, he stocked the medications in the 51 and 52 wings first. Then, for reasons he still can't explain, he suddenly felt the urge to check the section of the floor that was under renovation. The 54 and 55 wings had been completely empty for days. There were no patients, no nurses, no staff. Just long, cold, silent hallways. He slowly made his way towards the deserted 55 wing. With every step, the sound of his shoes echoed through the empty hallway. Closed patient room doors, darkened lights, and endless white walls made it feel as though the entire floor hadn't taken a breath in days. Then, as he reached room 5512, he heard something. It sounded like a hospital bed shaking violently. Instinctively, he looked through the doorway, and the sight that met him made his blood run cold. An elderly man was lying on the bed, convulsing uncontrollably. His entire body was jerking with violent spasms. Blood streamed from his eyes, his nose, and his mouth. Beside him, the cardiac monitor screamed non-stop, its emergency alarm echoing through the... His heart seemed to stop for a moment. Instinctively, he stepped back behind the door frame. But in the very next second, a different thought hit him. If that man was really alive, every second mattered. He immediately looked back into the room. This time, there was nothing. The bed was perfectly made, as though no one had laid on it for hours. The heart monitor was off. There wasn't a single drop of blood. No patient. No sign that anyone had ever been there. The room was exactly what it had been before. Cold, silent, completely empty. For the first time that night, he truly began to wonder if he was hallucinating. Panicking, he hurried down the hallway, making a beeline for the elevators. But the biggest shock of the night was still waiting for him. Hospital, door, elevator. As soon as he reached the 1st floor, the elevator doors slid open. He was just about to step out when an elderly man wearing a hospital security uniform walked inside. A hospital ID badge was clipped to his shirt. As he passed by, he smiled, gently patted him on the shoulder, and silently took his place inside the elevator. That single touch sent a chill racing through his entire body, because he recognized the face immediately. It was him, the exact same elderly man, the one he had seen only minutes earlier, covered in blood, convulsing in room 5512. He stood there in complete shock. The elevator doors closed. Helplessly, he watched the floor indicator above the doors change. 2, 3, 4. The elevator was going straight to the 5th floor. But the terrifying part was, no one. He stood there, frozen, unable to move. His eyes remained locked on the elevator's digital display. 2nd floor, 3rd, 4th, then 5th. A moment later, he heard the faint sound of the elevator doors opening somewhere above him. Then, silence. Complete silence. He never saw anyone step out. Before he could even process what had happened, the elevator began moving again. Back down. He hadn't pressed a single button, yet only a few seconds later, the door slid open right in front of him. Holding his breath, he slowly looked inside. The elevator was completely empty. The elderly security guard was gone, as if he'd never been there at all. That was the moment his legs finally gave out. He turned and almost ran all the way back. The moment he reached the pharmacy, he pushed his medication cart off to the side and collapsed into a chair. His hands were still shaking. He kept trying to convince himself that everything he'd experienced was simply the result of staying awake for too long. To distract himself, he pulled out his phone and searched the internet. How long without sleep before hallucinations began? Almost every medical source gave the same answer. After 30 to 48 hours without sleep, people can begin experiencing visual and auditory hallucinations. He checked the time, then did the math. He had been awake for almost 38 hours. For the first time that night, he felt a little relieved. He leaned back in his chair and whispered to himself, "That's it. That has to be the explanation." None of it was real. But only a few minutes later, that comforting explanation was about to fall apart completely. At around 4 a.m., his shift finally came to an end. He walked out of the pharmacy and headed toward his wife's car in the parking lot. As he stepped outside the hospital, he did what he always did. He casually glanced back at the building one last time. The pharmacy sat directly beneath the abandoned 54 and 55 wings on the 5th floor. At the far end of that empty hallway, there was a large window overlooking the parking lot. The moment his eyes landed on it, he stopped dead in his tracks. Standing behind the glass was an elderly man, perfectly still, wearing the same hospital security uniform. The same faint smile, the same face. He stared straight down at him without blinking, as though he had been standing there the entire time, waiting for him to look up. He stared a little longer. The old man was still there, standing perfectly still, not moving, not blinking. For a split second, he tried to convince himself that it was probably a real security guard. But then he remembered. The entire 54-55 wing had been closed for days. No patients, no staff, no security officers were assigned to that section at all. A chill raced through his body. He quickly got into the car, but during the entire drive home, one question kept replaying in his mind. If all of this had been caused by sleep deprivation, why did I keep seeing the same man every single time? He had never seen that face before in his life, so why, out of every face imaginable, was his mind creating that one? He never found an answer, but one thing was certain. That wasn't the end of the fear. It was only the beginning. Sometime later, I heard another story. One that made me realize fear doesn't only hide in abandoned forests or empty hospitals. Sometimes it's waiting inside your own home. This is the story of a young woman who lived with her boyfriend in a quiet, safe neighborhood. Their house wasn't huge, but it was beautiful. A single-story home with 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and a basement. The street itself was unusually private. No house sat directly across from theirs. There were only 8 homes on the entire block, and a small wooded area just a short walk away. Everything about the neighborhood seemed peaceful. Nothing about it felt dangerous. Then, last October, her boyfriend left for Las Vegas with a group of friends. For the first time, she was going to spend several days completely alone in that house. What she didn't know was that someone else had already been watching it.
It all started with a single doorbell ring. Then, a knock on the window in the middle of the night. A stranger's voice called from outside. "I need help. I know you're home." She called the police. They searched the property, but found nothing. The next day, everything seemed normal again, until she came home late one night after a party. The moment she stepped inside, she felt a cold draft moving through the house. One of the windows was open. Then she noticed something even worse. The basement door was standing open. From somewhere deep in the darkness below, a steady click, click, click echoed up the stairs. As she slowly approached the basement entrance, the clicking suddenly stopped. Silence. Then, a calm, unmistakable voice drifted up from below. "You finally made it home." She didn't wait to see who had spoken. She ran for her life. She still lives in that same house today, but every single night before going to bed, she never forgets one thing. She checks every window, every door, and the basement lock, twice, because some terrifying nights eventually end, but the fear they leave behind never.
If that had been the end of the story, you could probably dismiss all 3 incidents as nothing more than terrifying coincidences. But there was one chilling detail that every one of them had in common. No one ever discovered who or what they had encountered. First, the unseen figure playing the flute deep in the forest. Then, the mysterious elderly man wandering the abandoned 5th floor of an empty hospital. And finally, the unknown voice calling from the darkness of a home's basement. 3 different places, 3 different people, yet every story ended with the very same question, one that has never been answered. Maybe not every mystery is meant to be solved. Sometimes, the safest decision you can make is to trust that quiet feeling telling you to stay away from a place, even when you can't explain why. Because fear doesn't always reveal itself, and just because you can't see it doesn't mean it isn't there.
If you've made it this far, then ask yourself one question. Was there a logical explanation behind all 3 of these stories? Or did they involve something we still don't understand? Maybe there really was an unknown person playing a flute deep in the woods. Maybe spending 38 straight hours awake caused the hospital worker to experience terrifying hallucinations. And it's entirely possible that an intruder had entered the house, then slipped away before the police ever arrived. But sometimes, even when every event seems to have a reasonable explanation, a few questions refuse to be answered. And those unanswered questions are what keep these stories alive for years. Maybe that's why, on nights when the world becomes almost unnaturally quiet, some people still believe they can hear the faint sound of a flute drifting through the darkness somewhere far.
If you enjoyed this terrifying journey, subscribe to Mr. Nightmare 2.0 and become part of our growing horror community. Sweet dreams, if you can sleep.